They're at the intersection of Cherry and Albemarle Street. Here's the front entrance gate to Hollywood Cemetery. April 2020. Here's a guide map showing the overall outline of the cemetery. And a list of notables. 2 presidents of the United States, 1 president of the Confederacy, 6 governors of Virginia. Other notables. And then locations on the map for those notables. Here's the original entrance facing east towards the city on Cherry Street. You can see the gateway, kind of a Gothic theme that was put in early on, about the 1870s. And here we wonder kind of why you might start with a ruin, building a fresh ruin for the entrance. Tells you something about what they're looking for the visitor to experience when they get here. It's about atmosphere, a little bit about romance. The chapel here, there's the original gatehouse, but the mortuary chapel and the offices were expanded in the 1890s. And so you can see there the top level with its regular courses of stone were placed on top of that earlier kind of a rusticated look on the chapel. So there's the entrance, and there's also a nice line of holly trees down the entrance. So the holly trees are what gives the cemetery its name. When it was laid out by John Notman in the 1840s, the plan arrived in early 1848. He placed the entrance here because it was closest to the city, but also because he thought it would give kind of the most impressive sweep of the grounds as one arrived. So we'll see that as we head down the main avenue here.
A lot of work. I didn't know how to do that.
Here we are at the bottom of the entrance hill. You can see there's no graves down there. That used to be a water feature in some lowlands. So the graves come right down to the edge of what was once a portion of the lakes. On this side it was wetlands as well. You can see some cypress trees that do like the wet, and some construction here, putting in a new memorial area. Some dog walkers. We are at Westvale Avenue and Confederate Avenue. can see here the family sections with the curbing and the name on the steps. We've got the stars next to the Nesbits. Parker. A few historic graves on this side. There's a blue line on the side of the road, which is intended to help guide visitors to some of the more prominent sites throughout the cemetery. It's possible to get lost in the cemetery, and so the blue line will kind of guide you around. I always visit our little Georgie, George Henry, portrayed as a little angel after he died in 1860, son of the Johnsons. New facility construction, more dog walkers. We're entering up here on the Confederate section, or the soldier section. First thing we noticed at the soldiers section was all the new VA stones that have been procured by the federal government recently to mark the remains of Confederate soldiers buried here. Up to 18,000 total here in the soldiers section. So of course these are the modern stones. We also noticed the range of origins of people, soldiers buried here. So you've got South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Virginia, Alabama, North Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana. There are a few contemporary stones from the 1800s. This one looks O.A. Klein, like it might be one, or T.N. Perkins. Most of the rest of these are these modern Veterans Affairs markers. One of the more notable ones in this section is underneath these trees. You see here the third grave marker for Henry Wyatt, the first battlefield casualty. A little bit hard to see in the shade here. This marker was put up in the 1950s by the Daughters of the Confederacy to honor the place of burial for Henry Wyatt, killed at the Battle of Big Bethel. As you can see, June 10, 1861. Body was brought up from Yorktown by train and given an honorable burial here, and called the first martyr kind of the Southern cause, given his battlefield death in that first battlefield engagement. Get a nice overall view of the grounds. You also see the flags, fewer flags than we might see ordinarily, but the flags are generally refreshed over the years, throughout the year. And then a view of the Confederate monument, raised in 1869 with funds from the Hollywood Memorial Association of the Ladies of Richmond. Now we're a little bit closer to the 90-foot pyramid. We'll get even closer than that, but I did want to point out in this direction there's a brand new section that's been laid out, and modern burials are taking place there. So the cemetery continues with burials into the present day. And on the other side of that, we have the old soldier section set aside by the cemetery company in 1861 at the outset of the war. This is unmortared James River granite. Memory and eternity, eternal memory. The Egyptian theme of the pyramid of death and remembrance, monumental permanence. See it there, erected by the Hollywood Memorial Association, AD 1869. And later on a plaque celebrating the Ladies Hollywood Memorial Association. This is the northern edge of the cemetery. See all the American flags there. American flags didn't enter the soldiers section here until the 1880s, even then under some controversy. There's the speaker's platform. What you're seeing over there to the right is the Gettysburg section. In the early 1870s, the Ladies Memorial Association contracted with a doctor near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to disinter and ship to Richmond close to 3,000 graves, 3,000 remains, individual remains, that would be reburied here. Again, the ongoing kind of expansion after the war of the significance of the site and rising numbers of Confederate dead buried here. One of the key figures, the Battle of Gettysburg for the Confederates, was General George Pickett, who led the famous Pickett's Charge. And after his death, in the 1870s, his body was brought here and provided with a monument. Also, his wife, Sally Corbell Pickett, who died much later in the 1930s, took some time to get permission for her remains, her ashes, to be interred near her husband. And there was a period of controversy when cemetery company or the Ladies Memorial Association would not allow widows or spouses of the soldiers or the officers here to be buried in the section. But finally, as we can see, permission was granted for Sally Pickett. You can see that new section just across the hill. A monument to Jewish Confederates that was put up not too long ago. Seeing the back end of some of these mausoleums as we leave the soldiers section. Some of the earlier carriage roads, the granite markers for the soldiers section. So after seeing close to 18,000 Confederate soldiers, significant officers, initial battlefield deaths, and yet here at this intersection we find one of the main attention getters in the cemetery. One of the other primary attractions here is the Reese family plot. You can see Charles Reese's cross there, but of course it's the iron dog in the shape of a Newfoundland dog that is at watch over Bernardina Reese's cradle grave. And usually, as I was going to say, you can find little offerings in the young girl's grave. Here we find a teddy bear, a little wooden heart, painted rock. And the Newfoundland has lots of stories associated with it as to how it got here. She died in the 1860s during the war. Legends about how the dog moves around at night or growls if you get too close. There's apparently a beloved connection with the family. We moved it here next to her gravesite. All right. It's a relatively newer section to the west as we walk along following our blue line. You can see that there are plenty of Confederates, veterans buried in family plots throughout the rest of the cemetery. Lots of above-ground mausoleums from the 20th century. In the section there is the gravesite of a Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell. There's also ironwork, fences and gates surrounding individual family plots. There's an interesting stone from 1862 showing Captain W.R. Jeter. The stone carved by Charles Miller Walsh, Petersburg. The cross saber. After a while, the cemetery company tried to discourage families from putting up the iron fencing because it made it difficult to keep the sections kept up. Excuse me, hues. I've gotten interested in these handshake stones. There's one from 1887. It looks like a male and a female handshake. Perhaps the two spouses. And a great example of ironwork on this gateway with the family name. pressed into that cast iron. Some of their little cradle beds, cradle tombs. There's an early gravestone with a cross. This is among the more interesting fences in the cemetery. The upside down torches, signaling kind of the snuffing out of life. The grapevine, the grapes, perhaps the head of Jesus. Classical illusion. Another dog. Full-bodied sculpture. Looking right into the sun. Seeing an angel with a trumpet and an arm that must have been pointing perhaps upwards. Another full-bodied angel. Dropping flower petals on the grave. Nice view on the top of the hill. So then here we are on this blue path and we see the Stewart monument. General J.E.B. Stewart. You can see that there's lots of attention to his plot. He has a monument on Richmond's Monument Avenue. It's a cavalryman and was mortally wounded in a battle north of Richmond in 1864, brought back to the city where he died. And then right next to Jeb Stuart's plot, we see Ellen Glasgow, who was famous as a writer, a novelist, born into a prominent Richmond family, wrote novels about society in the South, but took a more critical eye of kind of celebration of the Old South and the lost cause. And so it's interesting to see her newer, almost Art Deco styled monument right next to much more traditional obelisk for Jeb Stuart. See an old carriageway that's been turned into more burial space. Some modern burials interspersed with the more historical burials. As we come down the hillside, you can see again the scale of the cemetery. The dogwood trees in bloom. You can begin to hear the sound of the river. You hear the sound of a train. Commander Wheat's grave in Louisiana. Coming up now on originally the westernmost mount of the cemetery, set aside for dignitaries, later renamed President's Circle, following the burial of James Monroe, and later John Tyler. Here we get this magisterial view of not only Belle Isle directly across the river and in the rapids, but also looking to the east, we see the city, downtown Richmond. And originally the state capitol, looking out over the river, would have been visible. And we have high-rises blocking that view right now. The first president's grave we come to is John Tyler. He was president, you see there, 1841 to 45. Originally had a very humble marker on his grave. He died in the midst of the war, the Civil War in 1862. But in the early 20th century, he got the column that we see here in the bust. Next to John Tyler is Matthew Fontaine Maury, who was a diplomat for the Confederacy during the Civil War. He was a scientist. He's connected with the Confederate Navy. Has a monument on Monument Avenue. Died in Lexington, Virginia. His body was shipped to Richmond for burial here. Angel. And approaching the center of President's Circle is the newly restored Gothic birdcage enclosure for James Monroe's tomb. And it's a sarcophagus looking thing, but he's actually buried in the ground below it all. This is all just a symbolic tomb on top. The enclosure here was placed over the gravesite a year after Monroe was reburied here in 1858. And then a few decades later, his daughter and wife removed burial alongside the President's Circle. And the new overlooks. Back down at the bottom of the hill, heading northeast out of the cemetery. As we leave, we see the grave of Douglas Southall Freeman, his wife. He's a famous author, journalist, high school in Henrico County named after him. In the brick enclosure up there, that's the original Harvey family burial ground. So when they sold Harvey's Woods to the Hollywood Cemetery Company, they made an arrangement to keep the family burial ground intact. And so it does have Harvey family graves still set within it. And directly across the valley, there's the officers section. Instead of the soldiers section that has the large pyramid monument, the cemetery company during the war created a separate section for officers to help kind of keep track of who was where and to provide another place of honor. So it has a flag and an archway at its entrance. And then along this avenue there's family crypts built into the hillside, as well as family plots stretching up the hillside. And we come upon a couple notable family crypts up ahead. This is the Pool Mausoleum. It was originally built in the late 1850s. It has kind of an Egyptian revival theme to it. Those narrowing columns on either side. Some Christian or biblical allusions on the top with the wolf and the lamb. But you can see that it's now the Pool Mausoleum, and it's got the Pool date of acquisition up there, 1913. And this is a notable site, just like the Iron Dog, for being an attraction of sorts in terms of folklore, because of its associations with the so-called Richmond vampire. And the story grew that after the Churchill Tunnel collapse in the 1920s, one of the figures seen racing out of it fled across the city and then into the Pool tomb. And so various stories started to circulate about what was in the Pool tomb. And so it's attracted a lot of unintentional traffic over here for the family. Another mausoleum, Schaefer's, 1861. And this is the tomb for James Branch Cabell. It's the namesake of the VCU library. He was a novelist and a writer in the early part of the 20th century. Wrote fantasy as well as other stuff. And one last notable mausoleum along this row, the Davies plot, the 1850s. We're back at the westernmost point of the cemetery. It was an addition after the Civil War. And would be the site of a number of hillside mausoleums, but most notably the Davis family circle. So after Jefferson Davis died New Orleans in 1889. He was buried there initially. Then his widow decided that it would be best for him to be buried in Richmond, capital of his scenes as President of the Confederate States of America. So he was brought back for burial in Hollywood Cemetery. His daughter, Marina Winnie Davis, was buried alongside him. She received a sculpture at the same time. Hers is, as you can see, an angel, sometimes called the Angel of Grief, whereas the monument provided for Jefferson Davis is a much more traditional kind of heroic pose based on his actual person. And then another one of the Davis's daughters, Margaret Hayes, who died in the early 20th century. She receives a much more figurative sculpture standing amidst a book. So the sculptor there you can see for Jefferson Davis, as well as Winnie's, is George Zolnay. And the family raised the funds for Jefferson Davis's monument, whereas it was a wider fundraising effort for Marina's grave. His wife was buried here as well. And then his son, Joseph. And other sons. So this takes us to the outer edge of the cemetery. Grave of Fitzhugh Lee, relative of Robert E. Lee, one-time governor of Virginia. As well as the Curry tomb. And ironically, a Grant buried directly across from Jefferson